Welcome to Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, thanks for watching. Minimum wage, your vote on November 3. Children in social isolation, as they say. Let's get to it.
Welcome to the fast-paced and unrehearsed weekly discussion featuring the leaders who help shape your world. Join us as we address the issues that impact you each and every day. This is Pennsylvania Newsmakers. And now, here's your host, Terry Madonna.
Joining me is Angela Couloumbis. She's a reporter, a journalist, I should say, with the Philadelphia Inquirer. As always, welcome, Angela.
Thanks for having me, Terry.
Well, I'll tell you, we're back to a debate that's been going on since about 2010.
That's right.
It's the minimum wage. It's $7.25. Pennsylvania uses the federal minimum wage, which is $7.25, and almost every year there's efforts to increase it. One was $15 an hour, and now there's some people who say, well, maybe 9, 10, 11.
Right.
So what's going on with it?
So Governor Wolf took the opportunity maybe about a week ago when we just hit the 11th anniversary of the last time the minimum wage was raised in Pennsylvania. As you mentioned, it's still $7.25, and Governor Wolf took the opportunity to make another pitch to the legislature to pass legislation to raise the minimum wage. He's advocated for starting at $12 an hour and moving it up.
Right.
He has also tied it to the pandemic in some ways, because he said you hear constant complaints that people don't want to go to work because they're making more on unemployment with the additional $600 from the federal government than they did at work. Well, maybe that should be sending a signal to you that you're not paying your workers enough.
Yeah. But I mean, traditionally, the legislature has been reluctant to push it up. When this debate occurred a couple years ago, I didn't think they would do $15 an hour, which has been one of the numbers that we heard a lot from a couple years ago. But I thought other states around us have done 11 and 12. One I think has even done like 9, 9.25. But the bigger point is there anything likely to happen? That's the big question. Anything likely to happen?
It's going to be very difficult. The legislature is now coming back in the fall, and it has a very truncated schedule of votes and voting days. The 2-year legislative session ends at the end of November, which means if something doesn't happen between then, they have to start from scratch in the next year in 2021. Sure. So it's highly unlikely, particularly since many of the legislative leaders in the legislature have said that they would prefer that it be handled on the federal level, that the federal minimum wage be raised, and Pennsylvania follow that. Having said that, there have been some efforts in the Senate to pass a far more modest minimum wage increase, so that could potentially tip the scales, and we have new leadership in the House, which may also make a difference.
So to use an expression, it's complicated.
It is very complicated.
All right. There was a hearing last week in the legislature that dealt with opening schools. We have 500 school districts, and nothing has, in a sense, been more complicated, if you will, and difficult to try to reach a consensus, whether it should be in person or online, remote education, or some combination of both. So what happened in the legislative hearing? First of all, was it in the House?
It was in the Senate.
In the Senate?
It was in the Senate, and there is another hearing coming up potentially next week. And I think what shows you is how important and really topic number one this subject has become in the legislature. What we're hearing from superintendents is that they want the Wolf administration to be more specific about guidelines for reopening, including what happens if a child or a teacher tests positive. Many schools they're not public health experts, is what they're saying, and they're not equipped to make these kinds of decisions, and they feel that the administration really has not provided that template for them.
And it's also going to add considerably to the expenses of operating the schools when you need protective gear, you need to, move desks. I mean, it's just not that, but it's also what do you do in these small cafeterias, how you keep people
disinfecting, cleaning, getting children to school in buses. All of these things have now been laid at the feet of local school districts who are trying to make the decision as to how to best handle it. And you've seen some of the larger school districts in the state, like Philadelphia, announce that they're going virtual only for at least the start of the school year, because it has become such a cumbersome, difficult proposition for them.
So maybe Governor Wolf will make a statement shortly.
I think he's under a lot of pressure. I think a lot of teachers have felt like they cannot go back to school and teach safely, and I think there's a lot of pressure on the administration to say statewide, you should at least start virtually.
Well, look, I want to thank you for coming in. Thanks for the update. All right, coming up, your vote on November 3. It's an important topic, and we're going to get into it with the Secretary of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania right after these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, the statewide voice of business, and by the Pennsylvania State Education Association and Partners for Public Education, bringing the power of a great education to our schools, our students, and our communities. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Highway Information Association, the go-to source to learn about transportation projects and issues. Please visit pahighwayinfo.org. And by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business.
Well, the topic right now is your vote on November 3. Joining me is Kathy Bookfar. She is the Secretary of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and the Election Bureau is under your domain. It's something you're responsible for. All right, we've had a number of conversations on this program about mail-in voting, and it's complicated. If I understand this right, 1.8 million people applied for mail-in ballots, and about 1.5 million actually cast votes. And it was about 50% of the people overall who voted, 35% turnout in the Pennsylvania primary. That could be doubled on November 3rd. So talk us through some aspects of mail-in voting that the voters ought to know.
Happy to, and thanks so much for having me on the show.
My pleasure.
So Act 77, historic bipartisan legislation passed in the fall. Thank goodness. One of the things it provided was that every Pennsylvanian voter can vote by mail, which is the first time. And the primary election of 2020 was the first election for it to be kicked off. And just to give you context of those numbers, in the 2016 presidential primary, only 84,000 Pennsylvanians voted absentee. So kudos to the election officials across Pennsylvania who went from 84,000 to almost 1.5 million Pennsylvanians voting absentee or by mail. So it's a very easy process, which is partly, part of why so many Pennsylvanians embraced it in the spring.
Yeah.
And we might double those numbers in the fall. So I urge every Pennsylvanian, you could go on now, go to votespa.com, you could apply, it takes a couple of minutes, and you're good to go. Yeah,
there are a number of problems, however, that were attendant to it. One is we didn't get the final results in every, legislative district and others for 1 month. If we have a close presidential election, it's mind-boggling to think that we won't know how Pennsylvania's 20 electoral votes are going to be cast.
So I just want to say it wasn't a month. There was about a week and a half or so while the counties were finalizing.
I read a month somewhere.
That's official, like when the certifications are stuck in the mail to the Department of State, but it was all done by then. There was about a week where we were really watching it, and then it was pretty much done. I have to say, from those numbers, right, you could imagine that going from 84,000 to 1.5 million is a sea change for the counties.
Yeah.
So the good news is they all know that. We got to see from the primary what this looks like now. So all the counties are staffing up, they're buying equipment, we're working with them on best practices, how to move back their timelines to make sure that they send ballots earlier.
Right.
And then you brought up the counting, right? So We're really hoping that the legislature will make critical legislative change.
So let me ask you a question. One of the ballots had to be postmarked by June 2nd, the primary, so presumably by November 3. But then some of them didn't arrive until later. So what should be done?
So under Pennsylvania law, they have to be received by Election Day. Governor Wolf in 6 counties, because of the civil unrest that happened right before the primary, for those 6 counties where there were shutdowns and election office closings and travel restrictions, those counties were able to postmark by June 2nd. But November 3rd, they actually have to be in hand by. So we'd like to see the legislature make a couple of changes. One, we'd like to see it postmarked by November 3rd, received by Friday, November 5th.
So there's several days in which if they arrive because of a mail problem, they're still going to be counted.
Exactly. It just makes sense, right? So we'd like to see that change. We'd also like to see the legislature allow the counties to start canvassing the ballots earlier, weeks before Election Day, so that we know on Election Day that it's all taken care of.
All right. We're going to continue with this subject, but I also want to talk about particularly election officials. All right. We'll be back in a moment.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by Cross-State Credit Union Association. Credit unions, where people are worth more than money. To find a credit union that is right for you, go to ibelong.org. And by the Energy Association of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania's energy information source. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Association of Pennsylvania State College and University Faculties, representing the faculty and coaches who are devoted to providing quality public higher education for Pennsylvania's college students.
All right, I'm chatting with Kathy Bookfar. She's the Secretary of the Commonwealth. Okay, so two envelopes are involved in doing the mail-in ballot. One contains the actual vote, and then there's a general envelope that gets you to the election officials in the county. And then in some cases, they didn't have the actual vote in an envelope, and there was some confusion about, the election officials and the people handing could immediately see how someone voted. Is that a serious problem?
So, there's a good reason for the 2 envelopes. You've got the outer envelope so that the counties can check the eligibility of the voter. That's essential. You can't count a vote unless you know who cast the vote and that they're eligible voters.
Right.
The inner envelope is a secrecy envelope. Also very important to give us a secrecy of the vote. However, if the person mistakenly leaves out the secrecy envelope, as long as you know the voter was an eligible voter, it's our belief that vote should be counted.
Right. Okay. One other issue has to do with drop boxes. Counties set up drop boxes where you didn't have to take it to the courthouse or wherever they wanted you to take it to, where election officials would be. The drop boxes are part of a lawsuit, I think, and somewhat controversial.
So the counties that used drop boxes throughout the primary really were incredibly thankful for the use of that, and so were the voters. So you had a pandemic where you were providing another option for voters to be able to deliver their ballot, not worry about mail, and give them confidence that their ballot was received. Same for the counties. It gave them tremendous confidence that they knew the ballots were received, and they appointed people to pick those up. Safe, secure process.
All right, I want to talk about election officials. We've had interesting situations where many election officials are elderly and they didn't want to, get in a confined space. That's one problem. The other is polling places were collapsed. You might have 3 or 4 polling places, merged into one, and that was particularly true in Philadelphia. So talk a little bit about election officials.
So this was, June 2nd was the converging of so many factors that I hope we never see something like that again. So in those unique circumstances, just for that election, there were broader allowances for consolidations of the polls. Now that June 2nd is gone, those provisions were temporary. So when counties want to consolidate polling places, they have to go into courts for approval for that. So everybody can assume that they go back to the presumption of their precinct polling place.
Yeah, and so do you think that's going to create some confusion, or or is that just going to increase mail-in voting?
Well, I think, you know what, the counties are spending a lot of time making sure that they communicate with their voters, and you can go onto votespa.com and you can check your polling place locator. So I think people will understand that June 2nd was June 2nd, and now we go back to the way it has been done previously.
Okay, we only have a 1 minute left, but let me say cybersecurity. What's that about in a minute?
So I want every Pennsylvanian to know that despite the fact that we're dealing with issues we never imagined, like a global pandemic, cybersecurity protections have not stopped in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is on the front lines making sure that at our federal, state, and local levels, we implement every single security practice to protect our elections and protect our votes. Every Pennsylvanian can go to the poll feeling confident in the security of their vote.
Well, look, I want to thank you for coming in, and we're going to see how this all plays out. I can't wait to see 3 million people or whatever use mail-in ballots and how that all works out. All right, coming up, children and social isolation, a topic you want to hang around with us for. Back in a moment.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Medical Society. Inspired physicians committed to the good health of Pennsylvanians and the advancement of the practice of medicine.
Angela Liddle joins me. She's the president and CEO of the Pennsylvania Family Support Alliance, and we're going to talk about a number of important topics. Well, let's start with the one I've been promoting, children and social isolation. What's that all about?
Well, it's obviously very concerning. You know, we lost the last almost half of the school year. Children were not being seen by teachers, school nurses, bus drivers. They're all mandated reporters of child abuse. So the reality is some children aren't safe in their home, and we depend on those mandated reporters to alert Child Protective Services when there's reason for concern.
What's mandated reporters?
Yeah, good question, Terry. Mandated reporters are professionals and some volunteers who work with children. So you think doctors, dentists, social workers, school teachers, primary folks that kids interface with through the course of services or their education.
Well, what social isolation? What do you mean that they're home and not in school and and they can't interact with their friends? I mean, and they're go ahead.
Absolutely, and we all know it's a very, very stressful time. We don't know anyone, right, who hasn't really articulated some stress level related to this. So imagine socioeconomically challenged right now, folks out of work, or the other side of it where parents are trying to do their job and full-time supervision of their children, where they were used to being in school, they were used to maybe daycare or childcare in the summer. That's wiped out now.
Yeah, and you got a lot of parents who, I mean, one of the concerns I hear, just anecdotally, has to do with parents who are working, and then the children are at home, and how they work that out. That gets complicated.
Perfect storm. And so, you know, some parents who would not normally tend to, you know, be abusive, you could be pushed to the brink. And then, of course, we know that there are some children who just have not been safe in their homes.
Yeah. So here's a question. I don't know if you have an answer for it. You probably do. How common is this social isolation and the various effects that it has on the children and the family? Yeah,
well, I think that story's yet to really be unraveled. I think when we all go back to what maybe more normal is, everyone expects, so let's kind of revisit the issue. From the beginning of the stay-home order by Governor Wolf, we saw a near immediate, almost 50%, 50 to 60% decrease in child abuse reports.
Now, remind everybody, me probably more than everybody, about mandated reporting. So if you, go ahead.
If you are a licensed professional in working with children through healthcare, education, generally you're a mandated reporter. If you volunteer, Big Brothers, Big Sisters.
So does that mean if you think, understand, or know there's child abuse, it gets reported?
You suspect.
Suspect. I'm glad you clarified that.
Yeah, if you suspect a child is being harmed and not safe, you are legally required to report. And let's make sure people know that number too. It's Childline. That's the state number, the hotline to call to report suspected child abuse at 1-800-932-0313. Yeah. So children not seen by mandated reporters, 50% on average decrease in reports. When you say, how big's the issue, how big's the concern, we don't know yet.
Yeah.
When kids go back into school, whenever that may be, we suspect then there will be an uptick in the number of reports because children will gradually either start to talk about, some safety concerns, or there may be visible signs of abuse and or neglect.
All right, there's also a serious concern. We've been talking on this program repeatedly about opening the schools. We have 500 school districts and other schools, private, and the fact of the matter is that opening the schools is controversial, how it gets done, and let's talk about the safety of the children.
Well, I think there's a lot of safety concerns. I think that not only do we have the obvious about the virus if we go back, into brick and mortar schools, but first of all, shout out to all of the teachers who used this different time of both stay home and then some virtual education to educate themselves on how to recognize and report child abuse. That's what Pennsylvania Family Support Alliance does. So kudos for them for using that time. One of the things we did and continue to do is focus on how to keep kids safe through virtual platform interaction. So teachers may in the fall be spending a lot of time with students on a virtual platform. They still can at times recognize child abuse or neglect through virtual interactions.
Right.
And still have a requirement to report abuse if they suspect it. So I think the concern is obviously the virus. The concern is catching things if something's going on in the home. You hope a student would somehow maybe get that message across on the virtual platform. If it's not obvious, then here's the really big concern too. The more time kids are online, there's a greater increase in predators, cyber security issues around child predators online. So parents have to be alert to that, and so do school personnel, and so do agencies that interact with children that way.
So you think once the pandemic subsides, we'll have the uptick in child abuse cases?
Absolutely.
There'll be an uptick?
Absolutely.
And there's nothing that will interfere with that?
I don't think anything will interfere with that. I think in this case, low numbers are not a good thing, and the reality is the best case scenario right now is calling on relatives to make sure that they keep in contact with children and their family, and to call upon neighbors to be good neighbors.
Well, look, I want to thank you for coming in and providing this update. All right, we'll see you next week for another edition of Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, stay well.